Hello, and welcome to this Rain Taxi virtual event featuring Michelle Nijhuis. I'm Eric Lorber. I'm the director of Rain Taxi. I'm so delighted that you can be with us tonight for this important conversation. If you don't yet know about Rain Taxi, we're a nonprofit devoted to books, and we express that devotion in many ways. We make a quarterly print magazine, and in fact, our 101st issue is at the printer as we speak. So if you want to learn about that or any of our other programs after tonight's event, check out our website, raintaxi.org. Become a member if you choose, and you'll get sent that issue right to your door. Aside from publishing, we also serve the field of literature through events like this one. Most of them are free to attend, but if you're able to pitch in a little something, you can use the donate button at the bottom of your screen. We are a nonprofit, and every dollar counts. We're privileged to receive some funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Minnesota State Arts Board, but our greatest funders are individual people like you. And there are a lot of ways you can participate, even though we're not in the same room exactly. You can use the chat, of course. So many of you are already chiming in, and it's great to see where you're from and what you're thinking about. Keep that going, of course. You can ask a question by using the Ask a Question box on your screen. And I'll be coming back later with at least a selection of those questions for both of our guests tonight. And of course, you can buy the book. And that is my favorite button on the screen by far, because when you buy a book at an event, you're supporting the author, you're supporting their publisher, you're supporting an event host and a great independent bookstore here in Minneapolis, Majors and Quinn. Tonight, if you buy the book, you get not only a signed copy, but the first 15 people will get this complimentary field notebook that goes with Beloved Beasts, and that has been given to us courtesy of W.W. Norton. So I hope you'll consider doing that. And if there are any other books on your wish list, keep it going. All the books you purchase from Majors and Quinn tonight help support our series. I'm so delighted Michelle Nijhuis could be with us to celebrate this beautiful book. She describes herself as a lapsed biologist, so I think biology's loss must be writing's gain. If you follow science writing, you've seen her work in The Atlantic, National Geographic, The New York Times, so many other places. Again, this new book is Beloved Beasts. It's a history of the conservation movement, but it's told with such grace and passion that I certainly, for one, have new appreciation for the vital work that people and organizations have done in the past, and a better understanding of where we're currently at in the effort to protect various species of life on this planet. To talk with Michelle tonight, we are so lucky to have with us Jenny Price, a writer, artist, and environmental historian. About 20 years ago, she published a landmark book of nature writing called Flight Maps. And next month, she'll release a new book called Stop Saving the Planet, an Environmentalist Manifesto. So we're in the excellent hands of two people tonight who know what they're talking about. I'm so pleased to welcome them both. And to start, Michelle is going to read a very brief excerpt from the book, and then she and Jenny will talk about it. Thanks again, and enjoy.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's great to be here. To most of us, the story of species conservation doesn't look much like a story. It looks like a jumble of tragedies and emergencies, obituaries and near obituaries, relieved only by sporadic heroics and temporary successes. It's easy to forget that the world we live in is far richer, thanks to those who found convincing reasons and the required means to provide sanctuary to other species. Without their work, there would likely be no bison, no tigers, and no elephants. There would be few, if any, whales, wolves, or egrets. We can learn from the history of conservation, from its successes and failures, its oversights and insights, for there is still no shortcut through the difficult work of protecting living organisms and the places they need to survive. And there is still no substitute for the emotional connection with other animals and other species the love of life that inspired the first modern conservationists and continues to sustain so many today.
Great. Well, I'm really, really happy to be here, really happy to be talking to you, Michelle. It's a real privilege. So I just want to start out as an historian by saying that, first of all, I love the book. I think a lot of people will. And there's no question when you read the book of your passion, your personal passion for wildlife and your alarm too. You talk about how 100 million species are at risk. We could lose a quarter of the species that we have 9,000 a year are going extinct. So there's this incredible alarm, and it's very clear that you want the book to be useful. And you're a journalist, right? So my question is really pops right off of what you just read is I find it so interesting that you chose to write a history as a way to be useful. That we're reading about Aldo Leopold and Rosalie Edge and Julian Huxley and a lot of really quite wonderful people that people might, more contemporary people that people might not have heard of. But I would love if maybe we could start off by if you could expand a little bit on why you thought that, kind of the useful way to get into this crisis was to through history.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. It's great to be here with you today, too. I have been a fan of your work since Flight Maps, which I think anyone who's interested in environmental issues remembers quite well. So I think I have been interested in the history of the conservation movement for a long time, partly because the more I write about conservation, the more I realize that conservationists themselves don't pay much attention to their own history. They tend to be preoccupied, understandably, with the emergency that's right in front of them, or else they tend to be thinking about evolutionary time. They don't tend to focus on the human's time scale. And I have been thinking about the history of conservation really ever since I was a biologist, actually, and getting acquainted with some of the politics around endangered species issues. But a few years ago, I came across some studies that were some of the first attempts really to quantify what the conservation movement had done for species, to look at the conservation status of different species worldwide and say, without conservation efforts, can we estimate where they would be otherwise? And I was really struck by the study because I thought, well, that seems so obvious, but yet nobody knows that, and it made me think that was, a very useful scientific study, but that the larger story of conservation that I had been thinking about for a long time and piecing together informally in my head might also be useful in that way in helping conservationists, but also anyone who's worried about biodiversity. I think a lot of us are. Okay, what have we done right and what have we done wrong, and what can we learn from our century or so of trying to protect other species from ourselves at a global scale? And then, just as a journalist, I've always been, my editors would say, overly interested in context. They would say too much backstory. So I think even though professional historians would probably be appalled at my research methods, I think I do share that interest in context and saying, what are the roots of this problem? Where did it come from? Who, I was always, as a journalist, always kind of searching back for the person or the origin of how these ideas first came to us, and trying to include as much of that in my stories as I was allowed to.
I don't think historians, having come out of history, I don't think historians would be appalled at all. I think they'd be very, very pleased to, have their students read this book.
I'm glad to hear it. They didn't see my office though when it was, when I was in the middle of the process.
Fortunately, nobody ever sees our offices when we're in the middle of the process. But yeah, I think I was sort of the opposite, where I was always not providing enough context as an historian, to be a writer. I think, and I think for me too, history is, it's where you come from, right? You have to understand how you got to where we are, but also that I think there's a certain power that historians have of making things not seem inevitable, right?
Yes,
also,
right.
So we have this crisis, but if you can show that it was the product of human decisions, that also, I think it empowers you,
Yes, I don't know if I was aware of that at the time, when I started this project, but I certainly became aware of it in the process of it. And yeah, the tragedies were not inevitable, and neither were the successes. And I think as conservationists or as people who care about species, we take the successes for granted. Oh, of course we have these animals, because it's almost unimaginable that we wouldn't have them. But we came very close in many cases to not having them.
Yeah.
So
that's really interesting. So it goes both ways, really. That
I think so.
neither the successes nor the destruction is inevitable.
I think so. And there's such a narrative of, apocalypse or inevitability in our culture now for very good reasons. I don't want to be dismissive of that. I've certainly felt it myself when I was, I live in the Pacific Northwest, and over the summer, not only were we trapped inside by the pandemic, but we were trapped inside by wildfire smoke. And, I sympathize with those feelings of where are we going? But I think the context of history can help us step back and say, yes, things have been bad before, and human decisions, human choices have helped us, stumble away from disaster.
Yeah, I like to say, we need STEM, sure, we need all those fields to grapple with issues like this, but I like to call it STEAM, right? You got to add humanities back in there because it's going to be really hard. I say, just good luck.
Yeah, STEAM, I like that.
I just want to stick with history for a sec because we're at such a historical moment when history has gotten so sticky and so problematic, right? And like our icons are literally toppling, right? All over the country. And so you have, there's a lot of characters in there. And of course, wildlife conservation historically has been critiqued for being, white and elitist. So, but I think you deal with it in an interesting way. So you have someone like William Hornaday, who on one hand is really shocking that you talk about in your book how he actually puts a person from the Congo in the primate house, which you just can't even believe. But then he also pretty much launches modern wildlife conservation with his efforts to preserve the bison. So maybe if you could talk about how you grappled with trying to write about people like William Hornaday.
Yeah, I mean,
if that's okay.
Hornaday, well, I was about to say Hornaday was probably the most complicated character in my book. And then I thought, no, there were several others that were at least as complicated. Yeah, and it was very interesting to be working on this project while we were in this very intense national discussion about the future of monuments. And I think it brought home to me how the problems with building a monument to anyone, because I mean, Hornaday's racism was shocking, even in the context of his time. Many other people have, in retrospect, have opinions that are reprehensible or say things that are reprehensible. And, we don't want to memorialize that. We don't want to build a statue to those opinions. But there's another memorial to Hornaday that I think is very well deserved. And that is the herds of bison that are now on the North American prairie, thanks to his efforts. Mm-hmm. And so I wholeheartedly support the drive to rethink these monuments that we built, in part because of knowing about these characters and how few of them were perfect, and mm-hmm. and how they are already memorialized in other ways by the work that they've done. They're memorialized, I think, in more appropriate ways that celebrates the quite significant things that they did that do benefit us today, and don't celebrate their blind spots and their shortcomings, some of which in many cases were enormous.
Yeah, and one of the stories I love, and then we'll move on to the 20th century, because you have a lot of great stories there. But one of the stories I love is this Hornaday story about, if you're thinking about the political context now of toppling icons and toppling monuments, that because of those efforts to preserve the bison, you now have indigenous groups today in the 21st century who are able to, use bison as a food, and they're actually raising bison. They're going back to bison hunting. They're trying to recreate bison prairie. to some degree. So I think that's really, really interesting, given that so much of this toppling has been about recognizing, Native American history.
Yeah.
Your history of Hornaday is just such a wonderful way of pointing out how complicated.
Yeah.
It is.
And for me, the tribal-led effort to restore bison to its ecological place on the North American continent is, to me, such an exciting effort. It's one of the most hopeful efforts in conservation, in part because it's taking a species that's doing well. It's not a species that's, in crisis, and saying, okay, we can go further. We can increase the size of the herds. We can increase the places that they can move. They can really start to change the prairie as they used to 200 years ago. And it's so redemptive in the light of Hornaday's flaws. I mean, his racism extended to Native Americans, and he blamed them, contrary to contemporary evidence, he blamed them for most of the bison slaughter. And the fact that there's now a tribal-led effort that's finishing his work is, to me, a lovely, just inspiring story of and an example that I think a lot of conservation efforts could and should follow.
Yeah, it's, I had heard of Hornaday. I'd heard of a lot of these people because I'm an environmental historian, but maybe a way of moving forward into the book is that, because I want to get to my favorite chapter, which is actually on community conservation, which is one of the later chapters, but I was continually amazed at the connections among these folks, right? So it's like, oh, this person who happens to be the nephew of this person, or this person who's this person's cousin or grandmother or grandson. And Stuart Udall was a pallbearer at Rachel Carson's, funeral.
Right.
I have this wonderful account of Rachel Carson reading Stan County Almanac by Aldo Leopold.
And hating it, yeah.
Hating it and having this, awful reaction. And, Aldo Leopold being Gifford Pinchot's student. And most of those connections I didn't know. It was almost like I was reading about the royal family or something.
Yeah. That was one of the great joys of the book for me, because like you, I had some sense, these guys were in the same era. These people might have bumped into each other, but there were so many of them the closer I looked. And on the one hand, it's a bit sad. It speaks to what a small world conservation is. But on the other hand, I think, probably much more significantly, it speaks to the fact that all of these people were listening to one another and learning from one another. Even though Rachel Carson hated Leopold's hunting tales, an opinion I should say that she later revised and said, well, I haven't quite read enough of Leopold to really be that mean about him, but she learned from him, and his ideas informed Silent Spring in many ways, and so I think conservationists not only don't know that much about their own history, but they don't think of it really as a movement with a past. They don't think of it as a tradition. It's more about, these iconic figures that we've all heard of. So it was really a pleasure for me, and helped answer some of my questions about conservation, to make those connections and trace those influences. Yeah,
it's wild. You watch these ideas being passed on really almost hand to hand in many places.
Yeah.
And the persistence of passion for conservation within families too.
Yes, right. And and so much of it does happen in childhood, of course. The love of other species is so often passed down by a relative or a friend, or just by childhood experiences. Probably my favorite story of connection is the birds, the raptor sanctuary that was founded in Western Pennsylvania by Rosalie Edge, who was a suffragist in the 1920s, 1930s, was, of course, very important in protecting birds, the migratory pathway for birds of prey in that area. But she caused a data collection tradition to be started that it ended up informing Rachel Carson and really helping Rachel Carson 25 years later build the case for Silent Spring. So that was such a concrete connection. And it was quite essential. It wasn't just a passing connection. The data from Hawk Mountain was quite a central piece of information as she built her case against DDT and tried to show its effects on wildlife. So if Rosalie Edge had not had that foresight a generation earlier, Silent Spring might have been a weaker book, and it was certainly put to the public test, and it was very important for her to have as much evidence as she did.
Yeah, and I love. It feels like the older stories that I knew something about. You've got kind of retell them in new ways. So, for example, I love that with Rosalie Edge. You said she's a suffragist, and I've done a little work on these women too. And now the stereotype, right? You think of the stereotype of the Audubon lady, right? It's sort of like the blue-haired lady out with their binoculars. And,
yeah.
But these were like powerful women, who were passionate about social justice and about environment, and they knew. We were talking before. They knew how to network.
Yeah,
so they were really the ones who created this grassroots movement, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of them might have had blue hair, but but they were badass ladies. They had come from they had come from a huge, almost earth-shattering success with the suffrage movement, and an international success. And a lot of them had gained activist chops that they hadn't had before. I mean, it was for a lot of them, it was a pathway out of the domestic sphere. A lot of these very intelligent women who had not been given the opportunity to work out of the house just really throve in the suffrage movement. And then some of them came to conservation and said, you guys are kind of complacent, you guys are kind of, beholden to your financial supporters and your rather conservative, these rather conservative sportsmen who aren't so fond of birds of prey and, tend to be kind of biased towards certain species. Like they had a larger vision. They had activist chops, and they had a larger vision for what conservation should be. And I really enjoyed learning about the connection between their thinking of the suffrage movement, in addition to all the other things it accomplished, being a training ground for women in conservation.
Were there people because you have to, I know when you do historical research, you spend a lot of time with these people, right? Did you have people who you just really fell in love with? Like, was there, a particular person that you write about that you just really fell in love with? And then maybe one who you kind of fell out of love with as you were writing about them?
I loved Stuart Udall. He was such a gent, and I should say Stuart Udall was the Secretary of the Interior during the Kennedy administration, and then through the Johnson administration. And he was a real champion of Rachel Carson. And he outlived her by 50 years. And he accomplished a lot himself during his life, but I fell in love with the way he was a male ally before there were male allies. I mean, he was always very generous about Rachel Carson, spoke of her with such respect for her mind. He didn't, he was not condescending or, he didn't pat her on the head, and he was insistent on that to the end of his life. He gave this very moving, speech at the 100th anniversary of Silent Spring, where he said, Rachel was a friend of mine, but she didn't come to me and say, you've got to stand up for me, Udall. She said, she stood up for herself. So he was very, I thought, wow, just a great supporter of important people in conservation, as well as being an important conservationist himself. And then, of course, I loved Eleanor Ostrom, who we can talk about when we talk about community conservation. I would say if there's anyone, I found something to love about everyone. And I found many things to love about Julian Huxley, but I also found him exhausting. And in part because he was, I think, personally exhausting to be around. People spoke of him as exhausting because he, I think, probably had bipolar disorder and had, went through periods of deep depression and then periods of really just, incredible activity. He was interested in so many things. And it was, there hasn't been a full biography written of him, I think, for good reason, because it would be such an overwhelming task to sort of make order of all of his ideas. So I had Yeah, I found him exhausting, but I also just I appreciated him. He was a great storyteller in his own way. So it was fun to read his memoirs and his own accounts of what he did.
But you don't want to live with him for 3 years.
No, I wouldn't want to be Julian Huxley's roommate. That's for sure.
Yeah. I love
his wife writes quite feelingly of how exhausting it was to be married to him. So
you're kind of married to him when you're writing about someone. So.
Yeah, it is a little bit like that. They haunt you from dawn to dusk, and sometimes more than that.
I remember with Rachel Carson that she actually was quite sick, right? When Silent Spring came out. By the time it came out, and there was some chemist, I forget his name. There was some chemist who was just going after on TV show after TV show after TV show, saying this woman didn't know what she was talking about, and they needed to listen to the scientists. And then she went on Eric Severide's program. Have you ever seen that program? And I
have. Yeah.
In like 20 minutes, just blew him out of the water.
Yeah. I mean, she was a very shy person by all accounts, but just a powerful speaker. And apparently, I mean, from what I've read of that interview, she had so much poise in the interview, but she was so sick. And she wore a heavy wig because she was in treatment for cancer, and quite, clearly to Eric Severide and the crew that accompanied him was so clearly sick that someone took him aside and said, you better air this interview quickly, because she doesn't look like she's going to last very long. And fortunately she did. And fortunately her interview did so much to defend her argument, but I'm sure it took an incredible amount out of her.
Well, maybe a way of moving forward, because I do really want to hear you talk about Eleanor Ostrom. Eleanor, yeah. Eleanor Ostrom, which I'm sure you can tell because I spaced her first name. Probably a lot of other people actually don't know who she is. Maybe one way of doing that is to ask you, like, what would one of these older folks who we know, and I'd be particularly interested in Rachel Carson, what would surprise the hell out of them if they saw what was going on in conservation today? And the reason I think I'm most interested in Rachel Carson is because I feel like of all the historical figures, she's the saint, right? She's the one there's almost like we need to like everything that Rachel Carson said is what we need to follow, But it's been a very, very long time between Rachel Carson and us, so I'm always a little suspicious of that. So to me, she seems like a good one to say, like, what would surprise the hell out of Rachel Carson in the field of wildlife, what's going on in wildlife conservation now?
Gosh, well, I know one thing that she would instantly take back were she to visit the Great Lakes would be her support of biocontrol as an or perhaps introducing other species as a control rather than pesticides, because she was looking for a way to avoid, this kind of, she wasn't opposed to, I feel like I have to say this every time I talk about Rachel Carson because it's such a persistent myth, but she was not opposed to all pesticide use. She was just opposed to the widespread sort of unthinking application of pesticides. And she, in Silent Spring, she says, well, there's these experiments there, where they're bringing in other species that might act as predators on these insects that devour crops or are harmful in other ways to human activities. That seems like a really good idea. I'm sure if she were to learn about some of the invasive species problems we have because of biocontrol experiments gone wrong, she would say, well, okay, maybe we should start looking for other alternatives. I am afraid that Rachel Carson would be sorry that we are still having some of the same arguments. And like you say, there's so much that she said. She was such an empath, she was so aware of that we needed to be more aware of our vulnerability, the vulnerability of our bodies to pollution, to environmental destruction of all kinds. And I think she so eloquently said that in so many ways, publicly and privately. And I think she would be dismayed to see that we are sometimes, we're sometimes so blind to that and answering the Anthropocene with more Anthropocene, so to speak, what Elizabeth Colbert in her new book calls it the control of nature, looking at our failed experiments such as biocontrol and saying, oh, well, let's try that again, instead of acquiring some humility and saying, wow, we are really we are part of this system that we have messed up in some serious ways, and we should think about how we're at risk, how other species are at risk, and think about how to reduce that risk.
Can we talk about community conservation now?
Yes, please.
Like I said, that was really my favorite chapter, because I just feel like it's so anti-instinctual for Americans, or a lot of Americans, thinking about conservation, what's going on in community conservation. And I feel like I didn't really understand it until I read your book. And I just actually wanted to read this quote as a kind of prelude. And then I really want to leave a little time to talk about sort of the various solutions and, like you said, biocontrol, genetic engineering, things like that. But you say conservation does have a blind spot, not inattention to human needs, but inattention to human complexity, which to me was really a wonderful sentence, in talking about community conservation.
Yeah.
Could you maybe tell people about it? Because I have a feeling a lot of people don't know much about it.
Yeah. Let's see, where should I start? Probably the best way to start thinking about community conservation is to think about the tragedy of the commons, which is an idea that I'm sure everyone has heard of. It comes from a paper written there's an academic paper that's pretty recent that's called "The Tragedy of the Commons is Pig Shit," which I think is like that. Which actually has a literal as well as metaphorical meaning that I won't go into, but it's one of my favorite academic paper titles of recent years. And so it was a paper published in Science. It's one of the most cited papers ever published in Science. I can assume some of those citations are critical, but not all of them. It's certainly a well-known theory, written by a fellow named Garrett Hardin, who was, especially in later life, became incredibly anti-immigration, quite racist. But it's too generous to call it a theory, but his proposal was that when humans are left to their own devices, they will take all the resources available to them until the resources are gone. So, and that this quote unquote tragedy of the commons, this using up of all resources, can only be prevented by total government control or total privatization. And this idea has taken hold in a way that I would love to hear some linguist or sociologist address, because it is so persistent in the environmental movement. Even though at the time it was published, there was a political scientist named Eleanor Ostrom, who was just getting her PhD, who looked at this and said, well, that's not true at all. In my PhD research, I'm seeing that these water users around the LA basin, as you know very well, where water is incredibly controversial, have come to some agreements about how to cooperate over the use of this, very scarce, very coveted shared resource. And they haven't had to resort to, some kind of authoritarian system or some kind of radical privatization. They've it's messy, but they've figured out how to do it. And so she spent the rest of her career really pushing back against this idea, and finding that all over the world, our systems have been operating in communities for centuries where people share their resources, whether that's pasture, or forest, or water, or other species, the species that they hunt for food or for shelter. And she, as a political scientist and an economist, she set about trying to diagnose why the systems that were successful worked and had endured for so long. And for that work, she eventually won the Nobel Prize in economics, but not until very close to the end of her life. And I think she's still not very well known, even within social science, or at least the significance of her ideas isn't as well recognized as it might be, even though her work has spawned an entire field of research called common property research. And she's certainly not well known in conservation. And I think even though she wasn't a professional conservationist herself, her ideas have huge implications for conservation, because, and I am making an enormous generalization here, this is not true certainly of every individual conservationist, but I feel like the movement, speaking very broadly, tends to operate from a tragedy of the commons assumption, that humans are pretty much a negative force, and that they can't be trusted. with full access to other species, and they probably in most cases can't have a constructive influence on their neighboring species. And so that is a big generalization about the international conservation movement, but the pushback to that started in the 1980s with community conservation in Africa. And that is a movement that has really tried to incorporate Elinor Ostrom's principles and tried to reinvigorate some of the systems that were in place before colonization in Africa and restore some local authority to people who live on communally managed lands, on indigenous lands in Africa. And that authority over, for instance, how many oryx are hunted in a season, or how poaching should be controlled, how local poaching should be controlled, and who should be appointed as the rangers for the community. That devolution of authority has, in Namibia, where I visited and is the focus of the chapter about community conservation, that's restored a sense of connection with other species that were for a long time thought of as property of the national government, or they were being conserved for the benefit of foreigners who wanted to go see them. But they were species that were at times kind of troublesome or dangerous: elephants, lions, leopards, rhinos, things that, are not sometimes as dangerous as people think, but they can, mess up people's crops, damage their property, sometimes hurt people. And people who were near national parks and so forth felt like they were being forced to carry all the burdens of conservation and realizing none of the benefits. Community conservation has returned some of those benefits, and the benefits for species have been amazing. Populations of rhinos and elephants are doing very well. And in that area of Namibia that I visited, the poaching of rhinos is way down, even though there's a wave of rhino poaching across a lot of Africa. And people are willing to, community conservation hasn't eliminated the costs of conservation, but it's brought them down far enough and given people enough benefits that people are now willing to say, right, we don't want we don't want these species to go extinct. That would be a terrible thing. They can be a pain sometimes, but we don't want them to go away forever, and we are willing to go to some trouble to protect them. We just need to have our basic needs met and have some control over these problems that they do cause. So for me, it was one of my favorite chapters too, and I'm going on at length about it because I felt so. I went to one of the annual meetings of a community conservancy, and I write about it in the book. And logistically, it was a bit of a mess, and there were, an sideline argument broke out, and so on the surface there were all kinds of problems. But when I stood up, I had this weird feeling of exhilaration, like, wow, these people who have very few resources went to all this trouble to come to this meeting and talk about the long-term future of their neighboring species. And I couldn't think of a time that I'd seen that happen in that explicit of a way, even though, I'd been to a million similar meetings of people with far more resources and time to spare.
Yeah, it's just an extraordinary chapter. And your description of those meetings was probably my favorite part of the book. And just to go back, when I read Tragedy of the Commons in graduate school, I thought, that doesn't make sense, right? It was sound like, but that doesn't make sense. And I think it's just liberal economics, right? It's right. Taking fact among conservationists and in biology and economics, but it's really just liberal economics, which assumes that people behave selfishly as a kind of core assumption, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
it's still taught in high schools.
Yeah, right. And people just say, oh, Tragedy of Commons, as if it's a fact,
Right.
And so I love that you went after it. And then you just have I just love these descriptions of you also being in the circle of all these people who have come from like fairly far away, who have no resources. It's not so easy for them to come to talk about the area that they're managing collectively, and all these just fine-grained decisions that they're making about okay, what's going on with poaching and how are we going to stop that? And maybe we could hire someone, and do we need a lodge? And, these really fine-grained decisions they're just amazing that they're making collectively,
Yeah.
and just talking to each other. And then you have this wonderful kind of piece about trophy hunting.
Yeah.
You're saying they actually have a more positive outlook on trophy hunting because it's often culling animals that they actually need to cull, if you're thinking ecologically, and it brings in income that allows us to fund, the warden that goes after the poacher or something like that. So it's just, there's so many ways in which it just flies in the face of, I think, what a lot of people will be expecting, and encourages us to think in really different, more creative, more complex ways about how to save these species.
Yeah, I was struck by all of those things, and I thought it bore out Eleanor Ostrom's insistence, often to her colleagues' exasperation, that there are no panaceas, there are no simple answers. Everything is complex, and she would often feel pressed by her colleagues to come up with, okay, and she did. I mean, I shouldn't say that there was no theory in her work. She did come up with a series of what she called design principles for community conservation, but she would always insist, what works in one place is not going to work in another. We have to respect the complexity of these systems, which are made up of people and other species and of the landscape and its resources. And so I don't want to hold up Namibia as a panacea in place of a outdated panacea. It's certainly not the answer to everything, but the model that it suggests, that idea that yes, there are ways for people to play a positive role in conservation. There are ways for them to reconnect with this sense of call it responsibility toward other species. Was really exciting to me. And I should say, just as a caveat, the system doesn't expect people with no resources to. This is not about devolving the costs of conservation or new costs or new burdens on people who already have too many burdens. I mean, these community conservation organizations are supported by they have technical support. Some of them have support from NGOs, but they're making decisions that they weren't able to make before, and they're participating in collecting the data and doing the work that's needed to make those decisions.
So I think we're actually should probably only take a few more minutes at most, unfortunately, because there's so much more to talk about. I have a whole list of things I want to ask you about, but also wondering if maybe we could just take the next 2 minutes, because I think your discussion of genetic engineering and rewilding, captive breeding is really, really interesting as kind of limited solutions. And I was hoping that instead of going into that, which I think we don't have that much time to do, if I could just read something that I loved from your book, and then maybe let you have a quick last word, and then we'll make sure that there are actually people out there who we haven't been able to see yet.
Yes, hello.
It hasn't just been the two of us. Okay, so you say you're responding to the famous Stuart Brand, saying we are as gods and we may as well get used to it. And you say the problem is that Homo sapiens is monumentally unprepared for divinity. As the presumptive drivers of evolution, we may not be dumb, but we are often drunk. We are easily distracted and chronically short-sighted. We are clever cousins of the mushrooms, promoted beyond our experience. Which I just love that paragraph. It just really encapsulates the problem. Oh, and also the guy who does captive breeding of coral, and people say, "Oh, okay, so now we don't have to worry about the Great Barrier Reef," and he's like, "What are you talk about?"
I hear his voice in my head often.
I'll pitch kind of the short last word to you, and then maybe we could bring Eric back in.
Yeah. I feel that we need our technology. I am not opposed to interventions, and even major interventions in emergencies, but I think the focus on these gee whiz interventions obscures the fact that there's so much we can protect that's still common and we're not doing the obvious things that we need to do to protect species while they're still thriving, while they're still common, and we're leaving conservation to the last minute, and then we're forced to use these kind of
Frankenstein.
Far-fetched solutions that are very exciting and very useful as insurance policies. And most of the people who work on them understand them in that context.
Mm-hmm.
But often, as I say in that chapter, sometimes people think, oh, well, great, now we can just make more animals, and nothing could be further from the truth.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. That was great. Eric, should we bring you back in and see what people are talking about out there?
Absolutely. We have a very rapt audience here looking at and appreciating what you're saying. Thank you so much. Several questions arise, and certainly you've teased some of them out in the conversation, even in these last moments. But one of them maybe is a practical question I heard not only tonight, but that I hear over and over. What really, how do you really think about the chances to make a difference? What is it going to take to affect the change that you've just spoken about as possible?
Great question. Well, may I refer you to Jenny's forthcoming book? Which is, no, I will answer the question, but I should say Jenny has a great book coming out in April, which is called Stop Saving the Planet. It's tongue-in-cheek, but if my book is a critique of the conservation movement, hers is a critique of environmentalism. And I think both address this question in different ways. What does it really take? And I think, I mean, I can talk about specific things, but there certainly are specific things that we can do as a country. We can first of all ratify the Convention on Biological Diversity. That would be a start. We're the only country that hasn't done that. But I really think what the conservation movement needs to do is step back from, as Jenny writes about very eloquently, step back from thinking that individual consumer decisions are going to save us, and think about what can we do collectively, what should we do collectively to broaden the conservation movement and open up an opportunity for conservation to become a universal practice, or at least a much more universal practice than it is now. It shouldn't be a special interest. It should be something that people do routinely. And I think that that's something that we can contribute to as individuals, is that rethinking of the conservation movement.
I'll just add a sentence. I think that's wonderful. And one of the things I take away from Michelle's book is we can't just build walls, right? We can't just preserve habitat. We have to live with wildlife in sustainable ways and in doable ways, which will also enrich our lives immeasurably.
Thank you. Yeah, I think those are great answers, because they ask us to change our paradigms a little bit, maybe even ask the questions a little bit differently. And I think that's so helpful and hopeful. Another question, and I suspect this one came from the tease you gave earlier about Rachel Carson not being so into Aldo Leopold, but certainly a dramatic figure for so many, an inspiring figure, and someone especially mentions that famous piece, The Land Ethic. That is something you do talk about in your book, and maybe they're asking a little more about, well, what were those influences, the agreements, the disagreements? How did that play out
between Rachel Carson and Aldo Leopold?
Well, I think Leopold's work in general, was it, does it still have an impact, or was it superseded in any way?
Well, I am a huge Leopold head, and Leopold, I actually was afraid that I was going to discover something some dark side of Aldo Leopold that I didn't know about in the course of researching this book. And I was quite relieved. I mean, like everyone else, Leopold is a human being, and his ideas evolved throughout his life. But he was such a humane person. I mean, I think he was a like well-rounded emotionally, and really had this vision of that it was both. It was both, I think, a vision of an older world, but also a prescient vision of a reciprocal relationship between humans and other species, and the need to recapture that. And his land ethic speaks to that. A lot of his other writing speaks to that. And Rachel Carson's very bitter letter after being asked for a blurb of a book of Aldo Leopold's hunting stories is very funny to read, because she really doesn't hold back. But and she was not a fan of hunting, especially not sport hunting. And Aldo Leopold was a very ethical, responsible hunter, but he was a devoted hunter, and she just had no patience for that. But I think, as I said, she did roll that back a bit, and I think she would agree with his central thesis that we gotta preserve relationships. This is not about protecting single species. This is about protecting the relationships between species and their landscapes, and that includes humans.
Right. Terrific. And this question is for both of you. Michelle already alluded to the humor, the tongue-in-cheekness of your new book, Jenny, your forthcoming book, and as I said at the top, we're at Rain Taxi. We're really very interested in how books are written, the styles, and the as much as the ideas in them. So I wanted to ask you both a little bit about that, because I think it's really clear that you care about the medium as much as the message, that you put a lot of work into how you're crafting these books. So yeah, just if you could speak a little bit about that, the writing side of it.
Take that first, Jenny.
Our books are so different in that
really
way.
Different, stylistically, really different. Yeah.
Michelle has this really lovely measured tone. You just trust her the whole way through. You want to have a beer with her or have tea with her or something. I have tried in the past to sort of get people to like me in my writing as a way of persuading them, and I'm trying something really different with this book. So it'll be really interesting in that it's angry. My book is really angry. I hope it's really funny too, as a way to kind of soften that anger. But it's an angry book, and it's an exasperated book, and I haven't really aimed for elegance in the writing. And I realized early on that one of the key things to allow me to write it was to realize that a lot of people weren't going to necessarily like it. It's probably not something I should say to try to promote the book. Hopefully the right people won't like it, and the right people will like it. But yeah, so it's, like you said, you make these choices, right? You have your own voice, your natural voice, right? And then you sort of craft it into this voice that becomes the book's voice, but you have choices about how to do that. It's always some version of your voice, right? So Michelle, I'm assuming that, this voice in this beautiful, beautiful book is not exactly your voice, right?
No.
You probably get a little more exasperated than you get in the book. Sometimes, where I'm probably not always as angry as I am in the book.
Yeah, it is funny. I have, wholeheartedly agreeing with most of the arguments in this book. It did make me want to go have a beer with you, but like at a loud bar and kind of do a lot of fist pounding and saying, "That's right, I've always thought that." And so rather like a beer with a different mood to it, maybe.
Yeah. Maybe shots.
Yeah, shots, exactly. And it's more of a shot book than a beer book, or a nursed drink in the corner book. That's so interesting what you say about, and it's so true about your voice. I mean, I think as writers, you spend a long time unconsciously and maybe consciously developing your voice, and then your voice varies depending on the audience. And just like it does in conversation, hopefully not so much that you lose the trust of your readers. But this book was written in a slightly different voice than a lot of my journalism. I knew I had more time, and I knew I wanted to just sit down and say, okay, like this is really complicated, and let's think it through together. I've taken the time to read this stuff. Let's talk about it. Let's figure it out. And I hope, that people sort of settle in and stick with me, because the arguments do take some time to build. When I talk about racism and conservation, I have a lot of examples and don't really comment on it until quite late in the book, when I feel like I've built up those examples and then said, here's the way I see this adding up. Here's the sort of general blind spot in conservation that this adds up to.
Absolutely. Beautifully put and beautifully done. Thank you for taking the time to write this book, and thank you both for spending this time with us. We all look forward to that day where we're having beers and debating books in person.
Right.
For now, we're just so delighted that you could be with us, and all our audience out there could be with us. Beloved Beasts, still on sale via our friends at Majors and Quinn. I think there's a few signed copies left. Until next time, everyone, thank you and good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.